Chapter 20. The day of the first snowfall, Mercy got out of bed. Judith, venturing outside as far as the well, came back, her cheeks glowing, with bits of feathery white clinging to her cloak and to her dark curls. "'Tis snowing," she announced. "Snowing!" Mercy struggled up on one elbow, her voice eager. "Come, let me touch it, Judith." Judith drew near the bed and held out her sleeve. The flecks of white vanished under Mercy's reverent fingertip. "I must see it," Mercy insisted. "Just for a moment, Mother. I can't miss the first snowfall." It took much preparation, as though for a long journey. 2 pairs of knitted wool stockings between her feet and the cold boards, the blue shawl wrapped securely about her ears, and a heavy quilt swaddled around her from head to foot. They formed a little procession, Rachel and Judith supporting the invalid at each elbow, and Kit following behind to hold up the trailing ends of the quilt from the sanded floor. Very slowly they crossed the room to the front window, and Mercy sank weakly into a chair and rested her chin against the window frame. Outside, the gray afternoon was speckled with drifting white. Already a thin, powdery dusting had gathered in the wagon ruts of the road. The flakes fell softly, vanishing in the heaps of brown leaves, swirling in little smoky coils. "I love the first snowfall better than anything in the world," sighed Mercy, her eyes worshipful. "I can't imagine why," said Judith practically. "It means you can scarcely step foot out the door again till spring." "I know, but 'tis so beautiful. And it makes the house seem so warm and safe. To think that Kit has never seen snow before. Go to the door, Kit, and feel it for me." Kit went obediently to the door and stepped outside. The white flakes made a queer sort of confusion before her eyes. They brushed her cheeks like tiny flower petals and caught on her eyelashes. For a moment her heart lifted with a trace of Mercy's excitement. Then the cold dampness soaked through her thin slippers, and she shivered. "I'm not sure I like it," she thought. "It's curious and lovely in a way, but it makes everything so dark, and somehow it makes me feel shut off. Somewhere, far beyond this endless curtain of white, green leaves and flowers were growing under a bright warm sun. Would she ever see them again? Next morning her dark fears were swept away in a rush of wonder. Under a cloudless blue sky stretched a breathtaking, glittering universe, carved of dazzling white coral, unreal and silent. Every familiar sign was altered. There was no trace of life or motion. It was as though no eye but hers had ever looked out upon this purity and perfection. Then, as she looked, a living thing dared to intrude upon this untouched wilderness. Through the white carven carpet that had been High Street pushed 4 oxen, buried up to their middles, dragging behind them a heavy plow. Snow fell away from the great blade in a gigantic wave. "They are breaking out the road," explained Judith. "Now we will be able to get to the lecture." That evening, for the first time since Kit's arrest, William came to call. He had stayed away, he explained, out of consideration for the illness in the house. He inquired courteously after Mercy's health, and she smiled at him from the bed where she sat propped against the feather pillows. Rachel fluttered to draw a chair for him. On the opposite side of the hearth, Kit was intent on her spinning. She had taken over Mercy's flax wheel and was slowly mastering the art of winding a fine uniform thread. It took concentration and a steady hand. Now the humming of the wheel barely slackened as she raised her eyes for one grave, cool look. William's eyes flickered away toward the leaping flames. It was Judith who kept the conversation going. She had fiercely resented her enforced absence from church and lectures. Now she demanded to know everything that had happened. Which of her friends were up and about when there might be a sleighing party? "I hope John gets back soon," she sighed. "Thankful Peabody's wedding is to be in December, and I can't bear it if he isn't here for that." They say in the town that there's been no word from the detachment since they stopped at Hadley. There's been new Indian raids up Deerfield Way." Judith dropped her knitting and stared at William. Mercy leaned her head back against the pillows and closed her eyes. Aunt Rachel sprang to her feet in alarm. "I'm surprised at you for spreading rumors, William," she reproved him. "They say no news is good news. Now 'tis way past Mercy's bedtime. She looks white as a ghost." She hesitated. "Kit, you and William can lay a fire in the company room if you like." Kit did not look up from her spinning. "'Twould take a monstrous lot of wood to heat the room before midnight," she observed. William took the hint and pulled on his heavy beaver fur coat and cap. Kit would not have risen from her place at all, but Rachel, with a meaningful nudge, handed her a candle, and she had perforce to see her suitor to the door. In the hallway, William did not seem disposed to hurry. He lingered so long that Kit was forced to shut the door behind them to keep the chilling draught from the kitchen. "I've missed you, Kit," said William finally. "I had to come back." Kit said nothing. "You don't seem very pleased to see me." How could a girl say that there had been a time when she had longed with all her heart to see him? Besides, there was something more on William's mind. "I don't want you to think that I hold anything against you, Kit," he said awkwardly. "Everyone knows that you meant well. They are all saying in the town what a help you've been to your aunt these past weeks. You'll find when you come back, I promise you, Kit, that everyone is willing to let bygones be bygones, and that you can make a fresh start." Kit looked down at the tip of William's great boot. "What do you mean by a fresh start?" she asked quietly. "I mean that it is well over. The Widow Tupper is gone, and it won't be necessary to see much of the Cruft child. Don't you agree, Kit, that from now on it would be wise to use a little more judgment about people?" "Mind you, I'm not speaking against Charity," he went on, seeing her mouth opening to protest. "We're supposed to care for the poor, but you overdo it, Kit." "But it wasn't Charity," Kit burst out. "Hannah and Prudence, they are my friends." "That's just what I mean. We're judged by the company we keep, and in our position people look to us for an example of what is right and proper." "And I'm to set an example by turning my back on my friends?" Kit's eyes glittered. "Oh, Kit," pleaded William miserably, "I didn't want to quarrel with you tonight, but try to see it from my side. It would make a man uneasy never knowing what his wife would do next." "'Twould make a wife uneasy, never knowing whether she could depend on her husband," Kit answered levelly. William had the grace to flush, but he held stubbornly to his position. A month ago, Kit's temper would have flared, but all at once she realized that William could not really anger her. She had had a long time to think, that night on the river bank and the longer night in the constable's shed. She had never consciously made any decision, but suddenly there it was, waiting and unmistakable. "'Tis no use, William," she said now. "You and I would always be uneasy, all of our lives. We would always be hoping for the other one to be different, and always being disappointed when it didn't happen. No matter how hard I tried, I know I could never care about the things that seem so important to you." "The house isn't important to you?" he asked slowly. "Yes, in a way it is," she admitted. "I'd like to live in a fine house, but not if it means I have to be an example, not if it means I can't choose my own friends." William, too, had been doing some thinking. He did not seem surprised, only gravely regretful. "Perhaps you're right, Kit," he conceded. "I've hoped all this year that you would forget your odd ways and learn to fit in here. If I thought you would just try." She shook her head. "Then I won't be coming again?" "'Tis no use, William," she repeated. At the door he turned and looked back, his face baffled and unhappy. There was in his eyes just the merest flicker of the look she had seen there on that first morning outside the meeting-house. In that instant Kit knew that she had only to speak one word or to stretch out her hand, but she did not speak, and presently William opened the door and was gone. Now the long evenings about the hearth were seldom relieved by any visitor. For hours on end, the whir of the spinning wheel and the twang of the loom were the only sounds, except for a formal bow of greeting on Sabbath morning, and on lecture day. Kit did not see William again till the day of Thankful Peabody's wedding. Thankful's wedding was the first festivity Wethersfield had enjoyed since the sickness. Through drifts of snow waist high, by sleigh and sled and snowshoe, young people and old folks and children gathered in the spacious Peabody house, relieved to shake off the labor and anxiety of the past weeks and to rejoice with the happy couple. The feast spread out on the board would be talked of for weeks to come. There were apple and mince and dried berry pies, little spice cakes with maple sugar frosting, candied fruits and nuts, pitchers of sweet apple cider, and great mugs of steaming flip for the men. I wonder what steaming flip is. 7 different kinds of cake, Judith counted surreptitiously. I'll never be able to have anything half so grand at my wedding. Kit scarcely heard her. She was remembering the last wedding she had attended. Could it be only a year ago, in Barbados? She could shut her eyes and see the long damask-covered table set with gold and silver plate. The banquet had lasted for 4 hours. Light from crystal chandeliers had twinkled back from gold braid and jewels. Deep windows had opened out on curving formal gardens, and the sea breezes had filled the room with the scent of flowers. An almost intolerable loneliness wrapped Kit away from the joyous crowd. She was filled with a restlessness she could not understand. What was it that plagued her with this longing to turn back? Was it that far-off memory of elegance and beauty? Or was it just the look in Thankful's eyes as she stood, radiant in her rose-colored lute-string wedding dress, and listened to the toast to her future? Kit and Judith, each lost in her own thoughts, stood together near the wall, unable to join in the merrymaking. From across the room, William watched them gravely, making no move. When the bride and groom had driven off in their sleigh toward the snug new house that awaited them, the guests turned back to the laden tables. 2 fiddlers in the corner scraped a lively tune, and some of the more daring young people began to dance. No one paid attention to the 2 tardy guests who appeared at the door, letting in a gust of wind, till suddenly a woman screamed and threw her arms about a snow-covered figure. Then abruptly the music stopped, and the laughter was checked, and everyone crowded about the newcomers. They were 2 Wethersfield men returned from Massachusetts with a detachment of militia. The story they had to tell put a somber end to the happy evening. Of the detachment of 20, only 8 had come back to Hartford. Just south of Hadley, before they could reach Deerfield, they had been ambushed by Indians, who attacked savagely with both arrows and French rifles. 4 men had been killed outright, and 2 others had died of wounds on the trail home. The rest had been surrounded and taken captive. For a few days the survivors had attempted to follow the Indians, till a heavy snow had made it impossible to go on. They had found the scalped body of one of the captives lying by the trail, and they had little hope that in that weather any of the prisoners would have been spared. They had turned back and made their way on snowshoes, barely reaching Hadley before another blizzard set in. The sobered guests crowded close, waiting for one answer. No, none of the Wethersfield men had been killed, but one of the captives was that young fellow who had been studying with the doctor, John Holbrook. In the mingled relief and horror, few of them noticed the faint wail that came from Judith, or saw her waver and fall. Kit and Rachel sprang forward, but it was William who reached her first and carried her gently to the settle by the fire. And it was William who later tucked her carefully into his sleigh and drove her home. In the weeks that followed, watching Judith, Kit began to understand how the gray shadow that was her Aunt Rachel could once have been the toast of an army. Hopelessness had erased the color and animation from Judith's face, and set her lovely features into a still mask. Kit ached for her, But even more, she was torn with pity for Mercy, whose grief could not find an outlet in a tear or word. Would Mercy's scant strength be equal to this burden? Rachel worried that her daughter did not gain, and fussed over the fire concocting nourishing stews which Mercy obediently tried to swallow. In some contradictory way, grief seemed to have etched on Mercy's thin face a beauty it had never possessed. Behind the clear gray eyes, the light still burned steadily. Should I tell her? Kit wondered. Surely now Mercy has a right to know that John loved her. But watching Mercy's stillness, she found a new patience to resist her own impulse. Some day the time would come when Mercy could know. The Christmas season passed, unmarked by any rejoicing. There was no holiday in this Puritan town, no feasting, no gifts. The day went by like any other, filled with work, and Kit said nothing, ashamed that in this somber household she should even remember a happy English Yuletide. January dragged by, and February. It was the hardest winter most of the townspeople could remember. Old people shook their heads, recalling blizzards of their childhood, but it was impossible for Kit to visualize anything more bleak than this first winter of her experience. She no longer saw any beauty in a world muffled in white. She hated the long days of imprisonment when there was nothing to see through the window but shifting curtains of pale gray, when drifts stood waist-high on the doorstep, and it took hours of back-breaking labor to carve a passage to the well. She hated the drafty floors and frigid corners, and the perpetual animal reek of heavy clothes hung about the fireplace to dry. Every night she shrank from the moment when she and Judith must make the dread ascent to the upstairs chamber with only the meager comfort of a warming pan. But impatient as she was with the long days indoors, the outdoors promised only aching misery. She resented the arduous preparation for the journey to meeting, the heavy leather boots, the knit socks drawn over them, the clumsy little foot stove they had to lug all the way, that cooled off long before the sermon was finished, and left one to sit with stinging fingers and toes, while the breath of the whole congregation rose like the smoke from so many pipes. How could Hannah ever have endured it? Kit often shivered, alone in that cabin with the wind howling outside, and no one to speak to for weeks on end but the cat and the goats. She hoped there was a cozy hearth at Nat's grandmother's house, and her own heart warmed at the thought of the two old ladies sharing it together. Then her restless thoughts would drift after the dolphin. Nat had offered to take her with him. Suppose she had accepted his offer. If she had never come back, would anyone here in this house really have cared very much? By now she would be in Barbados. At this very long moment she might be. The broom in her hand or the treadle under her foot would idle to a stop as she walked in imagination up the wide drive to her grandfather's house and stepped up to the long shady veranda. Then she would shake herself free. Such daydreaming was a weakness. The house was sold, and she was here in New England, and perhaps Nat had never really meant his offer at all. One night she woke from a vivid dream. She and Nat had stood side by side at the bow of the Dolphin, watching that familiar curving prow carving gently through calm turquoise water. They came soundlessly into a palm-studded harbor, fragrant with the scent of blossoms, and happiness was like sunshine, wrapping her round and pouring into her heart till it overflowed. She woke in the freezing darkness. "I want to go back," she admitted at last, weeping. "I want to go home where green things are growing, and I will never see snow again as long as I live." Her tears, scalding her eyelids, froze instantly against the pillow. Lying tense beside Judith, she made a resolve. After that, all through the cheerless days, she hugged the dream close. Sometimes, driven by her restlessness, she would talk about Barbados to Mercy. "Once, when I was quite small," she would say over the hum of the flax wheel, "my grandfather took me to see a great cave. You had to go to it when the tide was very low, and when a wave dashed across the rocks it made a sort of curtain across the opening of the cave. But inside it was very calm and still, and the water on the floor was as clear as glass. Underneath the water there was a sort of garden made of colored rocks, and all over the roof of the cave there were queer hanging shapes, like those icicles outside the window, only pale green and orange and rose-colored. It was so beautiful, Mercy. Mercy would look across at Kit's wistful face and smile in understanding. She knows, Kit thought. When I tell them that my mind is made up, she will not try to keep me. She will be sorry, I think, but truly, won't they, all of them, be a little relieved? In all honesty, she often argued, wouldn't she help the family most by leaving? Did the help she managed to give her aunt and uncle ever begin to make up for their trouble, and for the inescapable fact that she was another person to feed and clothe, though no one ever so much as hinted at it? The grim truth was that where a short time ago 2 girls had been well provided for, there was now every likelihood of 3 spinsters in the Wood household. No, she amended, Judith would never be a spinster. Kit had watched William's face in meeting, and she knew that he was only biding his time. And Judith, in spite of her downcast eyes, was well aware of this. By every right of beauty and accomplishment, Judith belonged in the new house on Broad Street. In their secret hearts, all 3 of them, she and William and Judith, had really known that all along. It needed only time now to bring about the match which Kit and John Holbrook had interrupted. In March, a fresh blizzard buried the town in drifts. The long days wore on, one as like another as the endless threads of the loom. Though the bitter cold did not abate, the daylight hours grew perceptibly longer. They lighted the candles a bit later every afternoon. Judith had just set the brass candlestick on the table one late afternoon, and the girls were moving the table nearer to the hearth in preparation for supper, when a knock sounded at the door. "See who it is, Kit," said Rachel absently. "I don't want to take my hands out of this flour." Kit went into the hallway, leaving the kitchen door open behind her, drew back the bolt, and opened the door. A gaunt, ragged figure stood on the step, and as she shrank back, a man pushed his way through the door and halted on the kitchen threshold. Judith suddenly let fall a wooden bowl with a clatter. Rachel, wiping her hands on her apron, came forward, peering in the dim light. "Can it be? John?" she breathed tremulously. The man did not even hear her. His eyes had gone straight to Mercy, where she sat by the hearth, and her own eyes stared back, enormous in her white face. Then, with a hoarse, wordless sigh, John Holbrook stumbled across the room and went down on his knees, with his head in Mercy's lap. Where it should be. Okay, I'm excited. There's only one more chapter.